Good morning, everyone. My name is Nancy Horvath, and I work at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto. I am also one of the organizing committee members of this fantastic series, the Diversity to Inclusion Philanthropy series, that is being put on by the Association of Fundraising Professionals Foundation of Canada, along with the Ottawa chapter and the Toronto chapter. It gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you here today. This is our 12th conference. And for those of you who have attended others, this is actually the last in our series. So this is a really amazing, amazing accomplishment, and huge kudos and thank you to all of you who are here joining us today. Before I invite our advisory chair, a very well-known person within the Ottawa community and beyond, David Jelena, up to say a few words, I just wanted to provide you with a bit of background on this initiative. So almost 3 years ago, these three groups joined forces, the AFP Foundation Canada, the Toronto and Ottawa chapters, and we applied for funding from the Ministry of Citizenship and Immigration and their Partnership Project Office. The goal of our project was to better understand what philanthropy means in different communities. For the purposes of this grant, we've focused on 12 different communities, and we wanted to uncover what philanthropy meant to people by listening to their stories and providing a dedicated space for an honest exchange about how to strengthen our work and relationships within our communities. We have done this by providing one-day conferences, like this here today, that bring together for the very first time in Canada donors, fundraisers, volunteers, and nonprofit managers to look at what we know and what we don't know about giving within the community of focus, and how we can work together to become a more world-class, forward-thinking, and inclusively minded sector in the not-for-profit sector. Over the last 2 years that we've been actually running the conferences, because some of the time we needed to do some planning, we have held conferences in both Toronto and Ottawa, and they've focused on philanthropy in various communities: the Muslim community, the Francophone Ontarian community, the LGBT community, next generation, women, Indigenous people, the Jewish community, the South Asian community, the Chinese community, the African Caribbean community, and the Hispanic community. And today, our final community of people with disabilities and philanthropy. We have cut across diasporas, cultures, and faiths, as well as other dimensions of diversity. And for each of these conferences, they have been video recorded and archived for future references. So if you weren't able to attend some of the conferences, you can go to our website, afpinclusivegiving.ca, to check out the materials. They're all available for free. And you can also join with us in social media. So we have an active following on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @inclusivegiving. So if you're joining in the conversation today in person, you can also join in on social media. You can also use the hashtag #inclusivegiving. We also have our Facebook page if you want to join the conversation further beyond just this conference. So it's the AFP Inclusive Giving Facebook page. But why have we done all of this? We started out and we had 5 goals, or learning outcomes, as some might say, for this project. We wanted to develop our cross-cultural competencies. We wanted to rethink and imagine the ways in which fundraisers identify, cultivate, solicit, and thank donors that support our organizations. We wanted to learn about the best ways to promote and engage people on both the ground and at the leadership levels. We also wanted to gain an appreciation of the nuances found within each community, what we like to call the diversity within diversity factor. And finally, we wanted to offer an opportunity for networking, to be able to engage the community further, and follow that up with a research initiative as we take the learnings away from today. At the end, we hope that we will have created a foundation from which new conversations will emerge and more advanced information sharing can take place. As I said before, this is the first time in our sector, in both Ontario and in Canada. Some have even told us that this is the first time in North America that we have approached diversity, inclusion, and giving with such rigor and deep coordination. So let's treat this as an opening conversation. This is not going to be the be-all and end-all of today. Thank you all so much for joining us and for your interest in coming today. We are so pleased to shine light on people with disabilities and philanthropy, and I am very delighted to have David, our advisory committee co-chair, come up and welcome you as well.
Well, thank you all very much. And Nancy, a great intro to get us started on our day of inclusion and fundraising issue with people with disabilities. Before we get started, I will make a gift of special information for you. And this gift will help ensure that we all have lunch at lunchtime and not at twilight. With a visual impairment, I often memorize material and edit some of the material I've been given to read. For those of you who can see, I often transfer the print into handy, 25 or 30 point. So I will be reading some edited material and will be speaking from memory. So the gift is we all eat at lunchtime, not at twilight. Nancy mentioned the word inclusion and inclusiveness. And I think we all begin to learn about how to be included from our parents, and then our teachers, colleagues, and the people we meet in life. If we're lucky enough to secure work, and most of us do in the world, we begin to learn more about inclusion. And my parents taught me well. My parents said, David, think of yourself always as being included. Don't fear being short. And don't fear being visually impaired. I think it was the shortness that began to creep up on me. And so we carry on in our lives the best we can. And 50 years later, I'm still short, but by virtue of the fact that I'm standing here, I am included. So I'm going to turn, for those of you who can't see, I'm going to be turning to read some material, which I have edited so that we can have lunch at the right time. It says here to welcome the audience. Nancy has already done a great job of doing that. And I'm here to tell you, and I will try and mic this so that my voice carries. So we have the following accessible services to tell you about. We have English Sign Language interpretation, which I can see to my right here. We have real-time captioning as well, on the monitor at the front of the room. And we also have attendant care. The attendant care today is offered by Henry, who will provide services when needed. Henry is wearing a Quality Care t-shirt and is available to assist as needed at any time. We also have a number of volunteers wearing a label with an AFP logo, and they would also be delighted to help us at any time. Our ASL, does anybody know what ASL stands for? ASL interpretation? American Sign Language. American Sign Language interpreters will say everything that is signed and sign everything that is said. The interpreters will not add words, edit, or censor a conversation. A gentle reminder that today is scent-free, and please use the microphones provided, the two of them, at the front of the room so that everyone can hear questions, and hopefully, I know they'll get the answers. For the benefit of participants who have a visual impairment, it also helps to say who you are when you speak, and that really does help me a great deal, by the way, as a visually impaired person. The nearest emergency exits are located at the sides and back of the room, directly behind me, and our accessible restroom facilities are also behind me through the doors into the corridor. I have found the one to my right the easiest, and the women's is on the left and the men's is on the right. Now, please keep aisles clear for access purposes. We have a feedback board in the back of the room where we look forward to your comments or suggestions, comments regarding the presentation today and how we can ensure that we pick up as much information from you on what you'd like us to add to our final report on this project. And it says here to review the agenda for the day, so I'm going to do that quickly. Coming up next is our first panel, from the charity model to the social model. We'll have lunch at 12 o'clock, during which we have 2 guest keynote speakers, Kevin Frost and Simon Eibel, who drove all the way from Toronto today and will be driving back right after his presentation. So it's a great contribution of his time and energy with us today. At 2, we'll have breakout sessions, engaging people with disabilities and storytelling with integrity. We'll have a coffee break from 3 to 3:30 or thereabouts, and then repeat the same breakout sessions so that people can benefit from both sessions should they so choose. And at 4:45, we'll have a really engaging presentation from Rich Donovan, who's just moved up from New York to Toronto recently and says he still loves New York City. And I don't blame him. It's a great city. And then yours truly will close things off. Now I'm going to introduce Brian Tardif, who is a panel moderator for the From Charity Model to Social Model, and invite panel members right now to approach the stage. As you do that, I'll tell you a bit about Brian. Brian Tardif has been the Executive Director of Citizen Advocacy Ottawa since 1935. Not really, 1985. He's held many positions with a number of agencies, including the Ottawa Distress Centre and Big Brothers Big Sisters, and is a trained facilitator. I've seen him at work. It is delightful. So ladies and gentlemen, our first event today, led by Brian Tardif, and we'll see you in a bit.
And welcome. And this is a great series, actually, this Diversity to Inclusion series. And you know, what's really important is, you know, the whole notion of the lens that you look through when you're actually thinking about fundraising and disability. And that lens is very much influenced by whether we look at what we're doing as charity versus social justice or within the kind of framework of you know, what is right and meaningful. So this first panel is going to offer some insights from 3 perspectives on this, and then I'm going to be asking them a series of questions, and then we're going to throw open the floor or you know, to questions from people in the audience. So firstly, I'd just like to introduce the 3 panelists. So we have to my immediate right, Laurie, Alphonse, and while they've all been introduced to you in your pamphlet, I will just highlight some of the things that are in the pamphlet. Many of you would know Laurie. She is a social worker who has both professional and personal insight, challenging the view that disability is a problem in need of conquering instead of use disability as part of a personal identity that has contributed to her success because of the way disability exclusion in society has shaped her approach to social justice. She's a professor of the social service program, or social service worker program at Algonquin College here in Ottawa, where she has taught community development since 2011. Now, I've known Laurie personally for many years from some other things that she's been involved with, but I also know that she was the recipient of a Celebration of People Award recently, and it's I think either last year or the year before. Yeah. And so, welcome, Laurie. Sitting immediately beside Laurie is Keenan Wellar, who many people know in the community. He is the co-founder of and co-leader of the Ottawa-based charitable organization called LiveWorkPlay. And this particular organization helps the community welcome people with intellectual disabilities to live, work, and play as valued citizens. His main focus is communications and social marketing of inclusive outcomes for individuals and communities. This includes leadership in the traditional media, social media, conference settings, professional journals to advocate for language and practices in fundraising and service delivery that go beyond mediation or remediation and accommodation, and instead promote a welcoming approach that fully values citizens with disabilities. And we all know, for those of us who do know Keenan, we know that he is an active member in the volunteer community and as a focus area champion for United Way Ottawa. And if you're familiar with LiveWorkPlay, they actually do some fantastic work in our community with people who have intellectual disabilities. So welcome, Keenan. And then sitting beside Keenan is Tracey Bailey, all the way from Toronto today, so welcome. Tracey is both a fundraiser and a communicator. She has been writing professionally for 33 years and fundraising for 28 of those years. In the past 2 decades, she has specialized in major gifts and campaigns, but has worked in every development function in every sector over her career, including education, health, social services, arts and religion. As a communication specialist, Tracey has experience in public government and community relations, marketing, sponsorship and fundraising, communications, as well as print and television journalism. Tracey has spent most of her career in the nonprofit sector as a management consultant, first in her own business, and then as a member of the KCI Ketchum Canada team. She rejoined Holland Bloorview in March of 2010. Previously, she was the Foundation's Defy Disability Campaign Director from 2002 to 2005 and was a client of the hospital from 1962 to 1978. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes, that's right. So what we've done is we've asked each of the panelists to basically take 3 minutes and just give you their perspective on the charity model versus the social justice model of organizations. And as I mentioned, you know, it's a really important conversation for us to be having, particularly those of us in the fundraising business, because the lens through which you see things is going to influence so many other elements of your fundraising work. So I'm going to start by asking Laurie to give us an overview of her perspective.
You'll have to forgive me. I'm not really used to speaking through a microphone. I just normally use my big booming professor voice, but I understand why they wanted me mic'd today. When we were hearing the introductory remarks this morning, 2 things stood out in my head. One was the fact that you've done all of these kinds of workshops for different sectors, and I've lived my life, my entire life, outside of one sector and part of 3 or 4. So from my perspective, I have all sorts of intersections all over the place. That is one point that I will give you off the top, is that you will often see people who don't exactly fit into one sector or another. And one of the things, as Brian said, I teach community development, and one of the things I always tell people is start where your client is at. If you're going to develop a program, you've got to start where the client is at. Well, that speaks to the social model of disability in that we have evolved over time. As I evolved a little different because I am the child of immigrants, Caribbean immigrants, and my father said, when I was really small, maybe 4 or 5, he said, Laurie, this country don't look like you. People are going to try and silence you. So if you have something to say, stand in a soapbox and say it, because, child, that's the only way you're going to get through life. That is my motto. And my father, who just celebrated his 80th birthday, is a man that I think gave me the courage and the drive to realize that I will put myself within my own social space, and I had to carve out a space for myself. That is not saying, I have a disability, can you please give me a space, as the charity model suggests sometimes. It is us carving out that space. And that's really, really important to realize, that people with disabilities, as we have become more diverse and more inclusive in society, will proceed to carve out our own space, and we will determine the accessibility that we need. So you need to begin that dialogue and keep that dialogue going, and that is basically why we're here today.
Nice.
Thank you, Laurie. We'll go next to Keenan.
Okay, am I on? I'm pleased to hear Laurie's comments, because following Laurie, I was quite intimidated that perhaps my comments would not align with yours. It's not a good place to be. But I think they do, and if I may be so bold, kind of an opposite side of a similar coin, which is my own personal stake in this. So I don't have a disability or a disability label. So why am I here? And believe me, I'm honored to be included in this community, because it's actually kind of a unique space. And how I got here, basically in 1989, through sheer happenstance, I actually misread the wording on a job application. I did not know that a developmental challenge had to do with disabilities, apparently. It was actually my thinking that this was about perhaps people from economically disadvantaged homes. And I had some experience working with that community, so I applied for a position. And it was actually for working with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And as they proceeded through the job interview, and I realized I had no idea what they were talking about, and I got the job, by the way, it struck me that for 21 years of my life in this community, for some reason, I had never met a person with Down syndrome. I had never met a person with autism. I had never met a person with cerebral palsy. And I was really angry and offended, and I was asking really ignorant, probing questions like, where have they been? Why has this happened? Well, I went all through a school system that segregated all those individuals somewhere else. I didn't see them, and they didn't see me. I was living my life in university and in the community. Once again, there's a special place where they go, and I don't see them, and they don't see me. Same as in my workplaces. Nobody there. So this really bothered me and struck me and stuck with me, even as I went on to a career for a little while in the high-tech industry. Felt that my soul was fading away, and kind of went back to this thought of maybe there's something I could do to make a difference. And so how this relates to the theme is that I see all this separation and segregation that is born out of the charity model thinking. It's not a mean-spirited thinking, it's an outdated thinking of people of difference being better off, separate, segregated, protected. And so, as Laurie was saying, as we move into the new way of thinking and doing, and people like Laurie and others driving that experience, but also there's a responsibility to the rest of the community, including fundraisers, that the way we talk and act is at the very least about asking questions and being welcoming and being inclusive, and not making assumptions on behalf of other people based on difference in labels. And so that's kind of how I look at the two models. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Keenan. And now we're going to go to Tracey.
Thank you, Brian. And Keenan and Laurie. Now, I have to stand up to show you a visual aid, and sorry to the cameraman who is going to have to move with me. But it is an excellent example of the charity model doing exceptional work. And it comes from the Sudbury Star in 1970. And there is a little girl in the corner here who has pigtails and a uniform on that's a white blouse and a dress her mother made her, white tights, black patent leather shoes. And she's in this advertisement holding an Easter seal, which when the picture was taken was a blank card. So imagine her shock when she saw this graphic design on this picture. And it's advertisement for the Easter seal campaign here in Ontario for the Ontario Society for Crippled Children. And this little girl, Miss Easter Seal of 1970, is me. Now, I want to read you some of the copy from this wonderful example of the charity model. Happiness is helping others. Good news, I hope that hasn't changed because I'm a fundraiser.
Yeah.
I raise money for persons with disabilities, so I hope that people are happy when they make gifts. It says, give crippled children the gift of joy and contentment by buying and using your Easter seals. And then here comes the fun stuff. When our own children are able to run, skip, play sports, and enjoy all the things kids do, it just doesn't seem right that others shouldn't. Most of us care enough to do something to help make life more enjoyable for the more than 500 crippled children in the Sudbury area. Do you? I like the call to action. We think you do, because we're eternally optimistic in the fundraising field. We're sure you'll let your heartstrings govern your purse strings in supporting the efforts of organizations that are asking you to support them in helping Sudbury. And it's signed by all of the clubs in the Sudbury region that are involved in this. Now, this campaign was hugely successful, raising money for children who lived in Sudbury. And I know this because although I was 9 years of age, I asked. I wanted to know. I was even target-driven then. This launched my fundraising career. So here I am, 44 years later, as the president and CEO of a children's rehab hospital foundation, taking all of the best that is the charity model and helping it evolve to 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, where there is equality and inclusion. And I know that the world is not accessible and not inclusive. And I say this to children and their parents and our donors every day. And instead I tell them my responsibility, my job, is to help build a winning mindset. That's my job. It's been my job for 44 years. It's really hard. Some days I don't even have a winning mindset. It can be so challenging. But I work with little kids. I'm profoundly fortunate to do that because they don't know any different yet. And they're strong and they're confident, like this little girl was. She was a fearless fundraiser. She had no trouble asking people to give money to help crippled children. She did not see herself as a crippled child. She was born with only one hand. They made a hook for her at the Ontario Society for Crippled Children. She had two hands. But there were other children she saw in wheelchairs, children who could not walk or talk. And she was going to help them. So I know that there is a lot we need to take forward from this. What was the best practice of this? And bring it forward. Donors, the fundraiser in me, and would the fundraisers in the room sort of self-identify here for me, if you could put up your hands? Okay.
That's pretty good.
All of you know in managing relationships with donors that it is imperative that you start at their start line. And if they are giving out of a sense of fear or guilt or gratitude or joy, wherever they are starting, that is the place you start to deepen the relationship, to change the story, to talk about and paint the dream of what it is, how it is that people with disabilities will live and be successful in the community. And so I'm here today, all day, to speak with you about best practices. What's working? How do we multiply that for everyone in every organization?
Thank you, Tracey. So now you have a little perspective on each of our panelists. Now I have developed 3 questions for each of the panelists. They've all had an opportunity to see those questions in advance, and so we're going to give each of them an opportunity to respond to the questions, and then, as I mentioned earlier, we'll have an open mic, and there's a microphone over here and one there. So the first question is, how would you briefly describe the characteristics of the social model versus the charity model of community service? And so just briefly, if each of you, and maybe we'll start with you, Tracey, and we'll work our way back. How would you respond to that question? Just briefly, what would you describe as the characteristics of each of these models?
So I would say, from having worked and lived most of all of my professional career in the charitable sector, for me, I focus on the strongest characteristic of that, which is generosity. People want to be generous, and they don't know how, and sometimes they need guidance and they need support. If they've made a donation, they have self-identified. And it's about the community coming together to demonstrate generosity. And as I get into this area where there is much more community engagement than there ever has been before, much more involvement of people with disabilities and people without disabilities in advancing the cause of our community, the biggest characteristic for me of the social model is the hope. The hope that things will change because people will come together to take action.
Okay, thank you. Keenan.
Well, if I was to only have one sentence, I would say that one model is deficits-based and one model is assets-based. And that's really, for me, what it boils down to. And as you look at individual organizations or campaigns, if you kind of apply that lens, you can probably sort out for yourself, where does this lie on a scale of, is this based on people's deficits or is this based on people's assets? So in honor of Rich Donovan, who's here and speaking later, if I was to look at employment, a lot of the continuing model in our society is that we fix the person who has a disability so that they become acceptable, and then we market them appropriately to employers who still don't hire them. Or the other approach is we work with employers and the community to change perceptions and defeat barriers and overcome attitudes and talk about the merits and benefits of people with disabilities as employees. And then you have employers who go out and champion this because it proves true that by hiring a person with a disability, they improve their workplace and developed an asset they had no idea was out there. And so, that's one of the stark contrasts right now exists in our society, is that we continue to invest in a lot of deficit-based thinking and programs, and we're trying to move that towards assets-based. And then I guess a future question, we'll figure out how fundraising fits into that.
Great, thank you. Laurie.
For me, I want to echo what Tracey and Keenan said, because I couldn't have said it better than they did. And the one thing I'll add to that is, for me, so the social model says, I don't have to ask to be included. I'm considered and included automatically. Charity model says, we'd like to include you, but there's this barrier and that barrier and another barrier as to why we can't. And I've come across this so many times in my life that I've lost count, where somebody says, you know, I'd like you to come and help us do this, but, you know, our facility isn't accessible, so I can't have you come. And I'm sitting there thinking, why are you having me come then? This is not for me. I've made them feel guilty somehow by existing. And they want to address their guilt, but don't know how. And I'll give you one example. A number of years ago, I was involved, during university, I was involved in accessibility, and a lot of accessibility on the campus of the university that I was attending. And they had one level of accessibility, and the manager of the building said, oh, no, you know, we're going to switch up the accessibility and we'll make, it was changes to washroom, make these changes over here. And he didn't consult anybody in the disability community, the office of persons with disabilities. He didn't consult anybody. He came to us after the construction was done and said, look what we've done for you. And we all looked at each other. There was about 4 of us in the room. After we toured the facility that they had spent probably thousands of dollars on, and said, oh my God, they're going to have to do it all over again because there's no way in hell this is accessible. So that's one of the things. If you don't bring people into the process and say to yourself, well, I'd like to, but, remove the I'd like you, but, and you have the social model. If you're still saying I'd like to, but, you're working from a charitable model because you're working from guilt, which is not a good place to work from.
Exactly.
Thank you. So just some of the things that triggered for me, again, was the notion of, you know, the deficit-based versus asset-based community thinking. I really liked the idea of the guilt and the fact that, you know, if you really look at it from an expectation to be included versus an invitation to be included, I think is what you're really talking about. And then, of course, Tracey, your comments around really the hope and, you know, the whole fact that the charity model, or rather the social model, really is built on the notion that things need to change and that change will happen if people come together. So really some good highlights here in terms of, you know, again, looking at and thinking about the lens through which we're going to look at things. So leading on to the next question, historically, we know that community organizations have been designed on the basis of the charity model. They've been designed on the basis of the fact that we actually were looking at what were the deficits and how could we actually fix those deficits, or you know, how could we fundraise, you know, using guilt. How could we include people by invitation? So when we look at how those organizations were often designed based on the charity model of social support, what I am curious to hear about is for organizations wanting to move from the charity model to the social justice model, or for organizations that are newly developing and want to actually avoid the charity model, what might be some of the important considerations from your perspective for their organization at both the governance and operational levels? And how about if we start with you, Keenan?
Sure. Well, I'll start with the bright side. So on the bright side, it's probably going to be very energizing for an organization that's undertaking that kind of a transformation, because now your whole focus is on championing the merits and benefits of inclusion and of the people you support, instead of so much of a focus on what they can't do. So I think that can be something to rally behind. Where the challenge comes in, and is right through the organization, from the governance team to the operations team, you're going to likely need to revise your mission, vision, and values, and then figure out how that translates into what you're delivering on the street. Because having gone through this in our own organization over the course of about 6-7 years, we used to operate site-based day programs, and then realized this was not actually helping anyone transition to anything. It was just teaching them how to be in a day program. So we abandoned that and worked on learning how do we support people to have success in their own community. And so this required revising our mission statement, which used to be about, I forget what it wasn't very good. It was about helping people with intellectual disabilities, and as Brian introduced me, we changed that to helping the community. So that's a massive switch in perspective, and so important that you're situating the challenge, as Laurie has elaborated, you're situating the challenge with a community that is not yet operating on the assumption of inclusion. And in fact, you may have been contributing to that problem by providing separated and segregated places for people to go. So there's a lot of work to do. And so at the governance and operations level, I think the first task is what is it we're trying to do, and how are we going to measure that? Because it'll be completely different. Whereas our past successes had been how many people came to the program. That's completely out the window. We don't have a program. So it's how many people are working, how many people have an apartment, how many friends do people have, what's their social capital? So that's a whole new ballgame. And if I was to pick one place to start with training at both levels of governance and operations, it would be person-centered thinking and planning. Because now it becomes about the individual lives and not about sort of a group outcome and measuring and reporting on programs. So it becomes, did Laurie get the things she was looking for? Did Joe get the things he was looking for? And not sort of a groupthink that's all based around the organization itself. So it's a big task, but I can tell you, very exciting and energizing. I can still feel the bubbles of excitement, even though it was 7 or 8 years ago when we started talking about this.
Great, thank you. Laurie.
On this question, I think, as we've gone through somewhat of a transformation in the community, in that when I started my career, we were still very government-based in terms of our funding models. If you needed money in the community, you went and you applied for a government grant, and most of the time you got it, and there was not much hemming and hawing around what your community involvements were going to be. Now, the government amounts are shrinking. Some people in the room might say they're almost gone. And to get any sort of funding, we have to talk about community partnerships. You must talk about community partnerships in terms of how many people you're helping, what you're helping them to do, and how does this enrich the community in general. And from my perspective as a professor of social service work, people will say to me, why do you do fundraising in the community development course? And I say to them, because fundraising as a social worker is going to be the lion's share of what you're going to do in your career, unfortunately, because it is, if you're going to work in the charitable sector, in a nonprofit sector, you are going to come across fundraisers, and most of the people in the smaller organizations that I have worked with, the finance people always say, I'm the finance person, but I'm not a fundraiser. I don't know how to engage fundraising and fundraisers, so help me on this one. And it's a work in progress. But this evolution is happening, and we're modeling through a new way of doing things. So I'm really glad to be here today, because maybe we can muddle through this together.
Great, thank you. And now we'll take it over to you, Tracey.
Brian, first of all, I have to say I'm going to make it my mission in life for this woman to love fundraising and not see it as an unfortunate part of it. Because money talks, people. If you have the money, then you can do what you want to do and what you need to do. You don't have to go and ask anybody for it. So let's figure out how we get these investments made so that we can do the work that needs to be done. So I need to turn all of you into evangelists for fundraising. You see, by coming here today. Okay, so that's job number one.
If you didn't live in Toronto, you'd come speak to my students.
All right, well, I can do that too. Get on the road. So that brings me to it's a good segue to my point on the topic of, what are big needs in governance and operational. On the governance side, we need more people with disabilities on boards of every kind, on corporate boards, on nonprofit boards, on community boards. And we need people, not just because they have a disability are they on the board, but because they have the talent, the passion, the leadership capability, and the positive attitude and the ability to collaborate and coordinate and make, amplify the voices of all other people. And I don't know about you, but I don't know too many. I've been around here a long time, but I don't know too many, senior management leaders in corporations and even on boards. I feel like I am an anomaly as the president and CEO of charity, and I'm a person with a disability. Little kids look at me and their parents look at me, and for some reason that word president, like when I was a vice president, that wasn't a really big deal, but when I became a president, the parents see possibilities for their kids they never saw before just because I have this title. So we need more presidents who have disabilities. Not people in their life with disabilities. Got lots of those. I got lots of those around my board table. What I don't have is a lot of people on my board table who have disabilities. One other guy. And then I've got 4 parents after that. Right? I need rich to be on my board. I need power, influence, affluence. That's what I'm looking for. We should have a prospect list of all the top people with disabilities in this country. And we should be plugging into them to help us mobilize more activity all the way through our system.
Agreed.
Good idea.
Agreed.
Number 2, what are we doing to groom the talent of our staff? How are we recruiting people, young people with disabilities, to come into entry-level jobs in our organization and be mentored and provided with the professional development they need so that they can be leaders in our organization? I moved up from the ground up. I don't think anybody gets parachuted into the front office. I had to do all that heavy lifting and work and have all those experiences been rejected, said no, have some successes, make tough decisions, watch others make tougher decisions, so that I get to a place where now I am in that seat and have to do that. So what are we doing to mentor young people? How many of you mentor young people? How many of you are sitting on boards of other charities? Maybe not just the organization you are involved in. We've got to spread the word, and the best way to learn about best practice is by serving one another. I can see the problems and I've got solutions for everybody else's organization but my own. I don't know what to do with my stuff. I need people to come in and say, this is so obvious, Tracey, over here. But I can go and do that for somebody else. And so we have to organize, we have to make the time to do that for one another.
Great, thank you. So a couple of things that really resonated with me, but I have a question. How many board members are in the room?
Yay.
Huh. Yeah, so about a dozen. Yeah, you are. Yeah, we have about a dozen board members in the room. Okay. Mm-hmm. So the whole notion that moving from a charity model to a social model is a transformation process. It doesn't happen overnight. It is a transformation process. That in fact our mission, vision, and values need to reflect the social model, or the social justice model is really important. And so one of the very first steps, of course, is going to have to be revisiting that. The other thing that I heard Laurie talk about is the fact that funding models are changing. And so fundraising is actually a really important element and often fundraising was viewed as a charity model approach to funding, but it isn't necessarily that anymore. In fact, fundraising actually speaks to community ownership in a very different way. And I can speak to that personally because at Citizen Advocacy we raise a lot of money annually. So that whole notion of the funding model and the recognition that no longer are we going to be going to government and getting all of our needs met, but nor should we, because ownership is very different when you have to do that. And again, I think Keenan can speak to that as well. If you're 100% owned or funded by government, your ownership is very different. So fundraising, really important. But how it gets done is different when you start to think about it from a social justice model perspective. My third question is, what might some of the specific implications for both individuals and organizations supporting people with disabilities who are engaged in fundraising? So what might be some of those specific implications for both individuals and organizations supporting people with disabilities who are engaged in fundraising? So you've already, Laurie, you've already spoken to some of that. You've talked about the board and the fact that we need more people with disabilities engaged in governance. We need more people with disabilities engaged as staff. I'm sure there are others that you can think about, and so I'm going to ask you to start the response to this question.
So I think one of the really best practices that we have to work, but we'll have to work very diligently at this, is that we give people with disabilities a voice and we get out of their way. We don't script them. We don't try to tweak it to our vision or our mission. Let them tell their stories. They do so in a very authentic voice. Some of the best storytellers in our hospital are 4- and 5-year-olds. Why? Because they've already had a lifetime of experience, and they're wise beyond their years. And they speak to individuals, and they get right through to the heart of it. They haven't got flowery language, they just got their own personal story. So one of the sessions here is on storytelling. I don't know who they're up against, everybody go to storytelling, right? So kids tell stories, parents tell stories, and I don't get in their way. I create opportunities for them to tell their stories. And I don't care if people cry. Because you know, if you're a fundraiser in this room, the gift is triggered by emotion, love, joy, surprise, fear, sadness. These are some of the key primary emotional triggers. And then secondly, you've got to create great experiences for your donors. So part of that is that you're out of the way, right? Although you're facilitating this relationship between, in my case, children with disabilities, people who want to support Holland Bloorview. I create opportunities for people to come together. Sometimes it's show and tell. Sometimes it's a conversation. Sometimes there's really great technology everybody just wants to play with. In our hospital, you know, we've had to make play a big part of care. And everybody's a kid at heart, and everybody comes in and plays in our building. So tours is huge for me. Because if I can get somebody through the door, they're going to say to me at the end of that, okay, I got to do something. What do you need me to do? And I have to be ready with all of the ways that people can participate in my organization. And it's not just about the gift, because sometimes the gift isn't the first thing that happens. Sometimes it's parents and grandparents want their kids to volunteer. They want to have this great volunteer experience in the hospital. We've got to make that happen. Sometimes they want to bring their friends back so they can go on a tour. Sometimes they want to know, how am I going to go out and tell this story now to other people? They'll say, when's the next event? I want to come to that. I've got to be ready for any of those things. So number 2 for me is creating those really great experiences. I think I had a third thing. I have to refer to my notes. In our building, we have moved through all of these words, right? We've been around for 115 years. We were the Home for Incurable Children. We were the Ontario Society for Crippled Children. Then we had a bunch of other names in between there. We've moved from handicap, that didn't last very long. Handicapable lasted less, didn't last at all. Disabled. In our building, you will hear children of differing abilities, kids of all abilities, right? But the great thing is that we celebrate difference. It comes down to everybody's different, everybody's got something. And I'll tell you a great story, if I can, from we have a school right inside our hospital, because we have kids who come to recover for 4 months to a year, so they got to keep going to school. School is a part of getting back to their life, the life before they got sick, before they had to have surgery. And down in the school, there are kids with and without disabilities. We don't discriminate, we're completely inclusive. We will include people without disabilities in all of our activities. And this little guy was in the school, and he came over I was talking to the director of the school, and he came over to tell me a great big story about how all his friends were different from him. And he had a friend who couldn't walk, and he had a friend who couldn't talk, and he had a friend who was learning to breathe again. And I said, well, how are you different? And he thought about it for a minute, and he goes, I have a wiggly tooth. And away he went. And in that school, they celebrate differences. Right? Differences are something to be celebrated. So we need to do more celebrating.
Great. Thank you. Keenan.
Terrific. Well, definitely, I was also going to focus on the storytelling and how that shifted and who's telling the story, which I think was really your point. Instead of a crafted message from a marketing person like myself that thinks he knows what people would say and what they want to hear, it is a real challenge, actually, to learn how to have a professional loss of control over your message. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about. And I've learned this lesson many times. I actually completed a professional certificate in nonprofit marketing from the Sprott School of Business. It gave me a binder which told me how you construct a story which will then be well received and generate donations. Well, I attempted to apply these lessons with spectacular lack of success. Compared to someone that we support who gets a job and his family or his employer takes a picture of him holding his paycheck and they post it on Facebook without any fanfare, planning, or binders, and it blows up into 2,000 comments. And who helped you with this? How did this happen? And so I would like more of that.
Yes.
And less of the binder, because the binder's not working so great. And some of the best information is, as you said, the unscripted. We had one of the people we support was participating in the run for the Government of Canada Charitable Workplace campaign, and he was interviewed while he was running by someone else who was running with an iPhone. And the comments he made were so much better than in the past. I had helped him prepare a speech, and he went around and made the speech, and it was fine. But the stuff that came out, I was taking notes as I watched the video of the things he was saying, because it was so much better than things I had conceived of. And so I think that's a big part of it. And this, my last comment is also, if we're talking about inclusion, talk about how people in the community have been impacted, not just the individual you're supporting and not just the organization's perspective. Some of the best response we get is from employers who were willing to have a conversation with us about employing people with disabilities. They actually took the step of doing it and then share with the community and, most importantly, other employers how that changed their workplace and made it better. And that business-to-business type of conversation is really, I think that's the defining difference, kind of the charity model and the social model, because business is part of that too. And when an employer is saying, hiring Joe was good for my business, and makes the case for that, that is really different than, so, you know, couldn't you be nice and do something? And so it kind of boils down to those types of storytelling differences. And I think that's the key is with the fundraising piece is I still see sometimes the fundraising message hasn't caught up to what's actually happening on the ground. And we need to make sure that's consistent. Within the same organization, one that I work with, the people that were doing their marketing and media actually had the message very solid, and then they sent me a copy of a fundraising letter they were planning to use, and they said, it's all deficits-based language. Go talk to the people that make your videos and change this. And so there's still a bit of a misalignment in some cases, and I think, you know, aligning the fundraising storytelling with the service delivery storytelling is really critical.
Laurie, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah. One of the things I can say on this topic is that your stories get capital in ways sometimes you don't expect, and I think that's a message that Keenan and Tracey were touching on. And one of the ways I've seen that happen is I'm a sailor, and people look at me and they go, "How you're in a chair? How do you sail?" And I go and I explain to them, you know, the boats are adapted, and I get somebody to transfer me in the boat, and I go out for a sail, and when I'm ready to come back, somebody's there to catch the boat and take me out, put me back in my chair. We go through fundraising exercises to help people pay their sailing lesson costs. And you're sitting there going, well, you know, it's an activity. Yeah, what of an impact does it have on people's lives? Well, let me tell you. I think the biggest impact that it has had on people's lives is confidence, myself included. But some of our greatest stories come from those of our members that have had strokes, brain injuries, and other disabilities come to them. And they were sailors beforehand. And when they get into our program, they say, I never thought I would do this again. I'm back in a boat and I'm sailing. This is life, and this is where I'm happiest. If you can find the happy place, to use the Disney analogy, in your storytelling, and you don't make it about the individual, but make it about what impact they have on the community because they're involved in an activity, it makes things tick a lot better in terms of fundraising.
Thank you. So we've heard about the importance of storytelling. We've heard about the importance of celebrating. We've heard about the importance of ensuring that impact is not just on the individual, but the community, and articulating, what that impact is. And we've heard about the importance of ensuring that there's consistency across the organization. Those were some of the themes that I picked out of what I just heard from the responses. Now we have about 5 minutes left, and before we break for lunch. So want to open it up to people in the audience who might have a burning question. Okay, so the question that David had was, do you make as much money in fundraising on the social model as you do on the charity model? And so has there been any experience around that? So that is the question for our panelists.
I think you have to preface it. I think you have to package. It's how things are packaged. Because I think people still are more familiar with the charity model. And that's what they go to first. And it's not a good thing, it's not a bad thing, it's just that's what people look at, what they're not familiar with, and they will go to the charity model first.
I'll go next in a second.
Sure, go ahead.
I know what you're going to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I'm going to guess that Tracey will expand on this, but I think we're talking about as fundraising and the connection to emotion being essential. And so, David, I would guess that one of the issues is the emotion of need is very strong. And so it's how do we connect with people in a similarly strong way on the emotion of success. And I think that's, our organization doesn't do any sort of needs-based marketing at all. It's mostly success-based, where we certainly identify that people have overcome barriers, but it's the celebration of success is how we target our fundraising efforts. And it is a challenge. People do respond very, often very emotionally to, oh, this wretched person that needs help. And so it's how do we move away from that message, which is counterproductive to inclusion and being welcoming and valued as an equal. How do we move away from that, but still noting that we need emotion in our fundraising or people won't pay attention? And so I think working hard on those success stories and making sure that they are impactful on people's emotions.
Thanks for the setup, Keenan. So our mass appeal fundraising activities, direct mail, third-party events, even signature events that your organization may run, are really struggling if you have a full-on kind of social context, and your ask needs to be very direct. And you've got about 3.5 seconds to get their attention. And you've got several thousand charities competing with you. And the ones who are very blatant, this could happen to your child, they're raising 10 times the money I'm raising by telling the success story of children. But I'm going to stay the course. And I'm actually looking to social media to change that up for me, for my those lines of business that I have. Now, I would say the social innovation, social entrepreneurship is playing very well for major gift fundraising. And because you're in direct conversation with people. So if they have a person with disability in their life, they've already got that emotional connection. And then it's about the value proposition, which you're going to hear a lot about from other people here today. Right? So I'm going to have impact because I'm making this investment. And I'm in it for the long term, not the short term. That's the way the major donor thinks. But it's still challenging. Right? Because you've got to find those individuals. Even if they have a connection, you have to find them. What's their connection to the disability space? And then it's a little bit harder for the person who has no connection, no experience of disability. Until they have that, then you're struggling to find that starting space because then they don't understand the value proposition.
Yeah.
So this is where my tours really help, because they come into my organization and they're overwhelmed. And some of them had no knowledge of disability at all, came in and said to me, okay, this is life-changing for me. Because, you know, they're in their 20s and they're in their 30s and they're in their 40s and they've never, to your point, never met a disabled person. Never had that experience. So we can't fault them for not having the experience. We have to go out and find them, bring them in. Help them have this amazing, incredible experience of people who are optimistic and passionate and, you know, going to change the world.
So I think what I'm hearing is that it's evolving. That in fact, you know, probably if we think about the charity model, they've raised a whole lot more money, but it is all evolving, and that's a good thing. And it's evolving because there's a demand for it to evolve as well. Do we have time for one more question? Yes? Yes, Bill.
Just in the move from the charity to the social model, one of the things, Bill Cowie, by the way, president of the Ottawa Carleton Association for Persons with Developmental Disabilities. One of the things we've been looking at and monitoring somewhat closely has been the new National Disability Insurance Scheme of the Australian government. I would say they're quite a bit down the pipe from us in terms of converting from a charity to a social model, but I was listening to a webinar from caregivers who were working with the program about 1 year after the program was being rolled out, and I would encourage you actually to go to their website. The discussion is fabulous, by the way. The feedback is honest and open. It's very good. But one of the things the caregivers were saying that the biggest challenge they had was getting the mindset of the caregivers to change from saying, okay, we've qualified for the program, what are you going to give us, to saying, well, what is it you need? And so it was a basic needs kind of strategy, which I think is very sound. But that particular scheme doubled the level of funding to the disabled sector in Australia from $8 to $15 billion. It was really quite a remarkable achievement. Anyway, just to sort of confirm, that mindset change is still going on with them, and it's very, very difficult.
Yeah, one of the interesting things when we made our transition was that first meeting with families, and when they said, well, what programs do you offer? And we said, none. And they said, well, what are we doing here? And I said, well, we would like to help your son or daughter have the life that they would like to have. And that was something they had not heard. They've been trained through the special education system and their whole experience with the adult services system. It's about pursuing the available programs and getting as much of those as you can. But then I think they ended up with us in the first place because they weren't necessarily happy with what they got to they won the race, and then they didn't actually like the prize. And so it is a new conversation, and it impacts on service delivery, fundraising, and throughout the organization, but very true.
Okay.
Sorry, Brian, can I just make one comment?
Sure.
I don't envy any family when their child either is born with a disability, acquires a disability, and right now we're doing a lot of work with families who have kids on the autism spectrum disorder. And even well-to-do and wealthy families of kids with autism don't think they have enough money to make sure that their children will benefit from and have a wonderful life. All they see is the great expense to them of accessing, disparate services, most of which have not been proven to be effective. And they're just wondering, they're at the starting line wondering how they're going to do this. And so this is the way they propose their questions to the community. And we live that every day in our hospital.